You spent years in a classroom conjugating verbs, memorizing vocabulary lists, drilling grammar rules on a whiteboard, and still couldn't hold a real conversation. Meanwhile, a child with no textbook, no grammar lesson, and no conscious effort at all becomes fluent in their native language by the time they're 5. This isn't a coincidence, and it isn't because children's brains are simply better at learning. It points to something almost every language classroom gets backward. Language isn't primarily learned through conscious study. It's acquired almost automatically through one very specific condition. A condition most traditional language education barely uses at all. In the 1980s, linguist Stephen Krashen proposed what became known as the input hypothesis. The idea that humans acquire language not by studying its rules, but by understanding messages that are slightly beyond their current level, a concept he formalized as I+1, where I represents a learner's current ability and +1 represents input just one small step beyond it. The theory made a sharp distinction that reframed how language should be taught. Acquisition, the subconscious, intuitive grasp of a language that lets someone speak fluently without thinking about grammar, versus learning, the conscious, rule-based knowledge that lets someone explain a grammar rule, but often fails to produce fluent, spontaneous speech. Krashen's central claim was that real fluency comes almost entirely from acquisition, not learning. And acquisition requires comprehensible input, not memorized rules. This explains a pattern language learners know painfully well. Someone can score highly on a grammar test and still freeze completely in an actual conversation. Conscious grammar knowledge lives in a different part of cognitive processing than the fast, intuitive language production needed for real-time speech. Under the pressure of an actual conversation, there simply isn't time to consciously apply a memorized rule. Fluent speech requires an internalized, automatic sense of correctness, not a lookup table. This is why native speakers can typically identify when a sentence sounds wrong without being able to explain the grammatical rule it violates. Their sense of correctness was built through massive exposure to comprehensible input, not through explicit rule memorization. And that same intuitive sense is exactly what traditional grammar-first instruction struggles to build. Not all input builds language equally. Input that's far too easy provides little new material for the brain to acquire. A fluent adult gains almost nothing from a children's picture book they already understand completely. Input that's far too difficult provides so little comprehension that the brain has nothing to anchor new patterns to. A beginner thrown into an unsubtitled academic lecture in a new language absorbs almost nothing, because there's no comprehensible context to attach the unfamiliar words to. The sweet spot, Krashen's I+1, is input a learner mostly understands, with just enough new vocabulary or structure woven in that meaning can still be inferred from context. This is precisely why well-designed, graded readers, slow-paced podcasts for learners, or conversations with a patient native speaker tend to produce faster real fluency gains than a dense grammar textbook. They consistently deliver input at exactly the difficulty level the brain can actually use. Krashen also proposed something that traditional classrooms often work directly against: the affective filter hypothesis. The idea that anxiety, stress, boredom, or low motivation act as a mental filter that blocks comprehensible input from being processed into acquisition, even when the input itself is perfectly pitched. This explains why so many people who studied a language for years in a high-pressure, exam-driven classroom retain surprisingly little, while others who picked up a language through relaxed immersion, watching shows, reading for pleasure, talking with friends, often develop stronger intuitive fluency in less total time. It's not that the second group is naturally gifted. It's that a relaxed, low-anxiety state allows comprehensible input to actually reach the part of the brain responsible for acquisition, instead of being blocked by the stress of performance and correction. Children aren't acquiring language through some mysterious biological shortcut unavailable to adults. They're simply immersed in an unusually ideal, comprehensible input environment almost constantly. Caregivers instinctively simplify their speech, exaggerate tone, repeat key words, and use context, pointing, gesturing, physical presence. to make meaning clear even when the exact words are new. This is functionally a perfect, naturally occurring I+1 environment, delivered for years, without exams, without correction-based anxiety, and without any pressure to perform. Adults can replicate far more of this than most language education assumes. The limiting factor for most adult learners isn't a closed biological window. It's that adult language education is typically built around testing and rule memorization instead of sustained, low-pressure, comprehensible exposure. Applying comprehensible input as a learning strategy comes down to a few concrete principles. Prioritize understanding meaning over analyzing grammar. If you can follow the general sense of a sentence, the brain is already doing useful acquisition work, even without consciously parsing every rule. Choose input just slightly above your current level rather than jumping to native speed, native complexity material too early. The goal is mostly understood input with a manageable amount of new material, not a battle against something incomprehensible. Reduce performance pressure. Passive, low-stakes exposure through shows, books, or casual conversation often builds more durable fluency than high-pressure testing environments. And prioritize consistency and volume. Krashen's research suggests that acquisition is primarily a function of the total amount of comprehensible input received over time, not the intensity of any single study session. The people who reach fluency fastest usually aren't the ones who studied the most grammar rules. They're the ones who spent the most time genuinely understanding a language slightly beyond their comfort zone, consistently, without the pressure that shuts the process down. Fluency was never really about memorizing a language. It was about giving your brain enough of the right kind of exposure to acquire it the same way it always knew how to. Mastering a new language, like mastering your mind, was never about forcing information in. It's about creating the right conditions and letting acquisition do what it was already built to do. If this resonated with you, subscribe, because next week we're breaking down the specific habits that turn passive comprehensible input into actual speaking fluency.